Nice to see you. Yeah. Okay. A very good evening to everybody, and it's almost 7:30. We start off with our today's webinar. I cordially invite for this all of you on a digital platform on a gynecological cancer, and we will try to look into different aspects, not the normal thing what we do in a gynae cancer. Just look into something new in endometrial cancer, cervical cancer, as well as ovarian cancer. So the COVID pandemic has brought all of us in a digital platform, and nice to see around 53 of us in looking at each other. Thanks to everybody. Thanks for spending an evening with us. I hand over the program to our chairperson, Dr. C. Sai Ram. He's a director and senior consultant clinical oncologist at Swarna Hospital, a radiation oncologist by profession. Also, Dr. Ganesh Venkatraman, who is a professor of human genetics at SRMC Chennai, to introduce our expert comments as well as our speaker and take us through the today's evening meeting. Hand it over to Dr. Sai Ram and Dr. Ganesh, please.
Thank you, madam. Dr. Anita Ramesh. Thank you for doing all the programs regularly. Gynec oncology is a big challenge for our country. As you all know, more than 1 lakh women with cervical cancer die every year, and most of the gynec oncology societies include breast as part of gynec oncology. So if you combine them, that is the biggest challenge of women cancers in the country. Unlike most other countries, we have no vaccination program in place, and we, as you all know, there is no proper screening modalities available in most of the setups, and we for ovarian cancer there is no screening recommended at all, and we have lot of diabetes and obesity in elderly women, and that is one of the major cause for endometrial cancers. So we have very high load of gynec cancers. In MNJ we see roughly around 800 to 1000 new patients of gynec malignancies, and we have seen a lot of drugs not being able to help from chemotherapy point of view because this plateau reached, and we also know that minimal access surgeries like has not shown any benefit, uh, like like robotic surgeries and all, and uh, of course local surgeries IMRT is still not approved for cervical cancers. So conformal radiation, local proper surgery, and drugs along with anti-angiogenic drugs seems to be doing little better now. So we'll see from various speakers what are the new anti-VEGF drugs, how does it help, and is there any role of immunotherapy drugs and other things. We'll come to know by various speakers, and we have very, very informed speakers from all over the country, and I think it will be very useful topic to be discussed this evening. Thank you, Anita, for giving me the opportunity to speak. And I have to inform you that today I have been elected as the president for 5,000 Indian Medical Association doctors uh, of Hyderabad. And I thank all of you for
Congratulations.
Congratulations. Congratulations. Thank you so much. Thank you. Great. It's nice to have you today evening with us on the day of your election. We need a treat, not a virtual real treat.
Sure.
We have to treat.
Once the COVID is over, we'll have again.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Along with Purvish Parikh.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Sairam. Okay, and I request Dr. Ganesh Venkatraman also to introduce our expert panel and also introduce the speaker.
Yeah. Good evening, Professor Anita. A warm welcome to you and to all the members who have joined here. So I'm very glad to be attending this program. This is one of our focus areas. I'm a basic scientist by training and profession. So I'm very happy and glad to join this meeting. So I'll just give a brief word about the importance of this program. The most recent 2020 statistics from ICMR states that cancers of breast, cervix, uterine, and ovary are the most common cancers among females in India. So this emphasizes the need to look at the upcoming treatment modalities and how to make things better for these three category of cancer treatments. And most important thing about why this topic is even more relevant is that gynecological malignancies are characterized by exacerbated angiogenesis protocols or the phenomenon. This is one of the most important hallmarks of cancer, which drives the process of ovarian carcinogenesis. So, and of which the central role of vascular endothelial growth factor is very, very important. VEGF plays a very important role in angiogenesis. So, formidable work in this area was carried out by one person, by Professor Judah Folkman from Harvard Medical School. He is considered as the father of angiogenesis. So, he was the first to propose way back 40 years back in 1970 that anti-angiogenic therapy will be a future of treatment. And so rightly he said, and that we are realizing in the last decade or so. So VEGF essentially is a polypeptide growth factor, acts via receptor tyrosine kinase. So, and several anti-angiogenic therapies are based upon this particular action of how VEGF works. So today's deliberations are essentially poised very well, looking at various aspects of how anti-VEGF treatments will work. So we're going to move on to the program, and I'm going to invite the first speaker for today. First speaker for today to start the proceedings. Over to the first speaker. Dr. Anita, you're muted. You have to unmute yourself.
Okay, fine. I invite our expert for today's evening, Dr. Abhijit Sarkar, clinical oncologist from Kolkata. Okay, Dr. Abhijit is very active in all the CMEs, and we like to hear from him. We want your comments after the speaker's talk. Also, Dr. Rajeshwar Singh, who is a director medical oncology at Paras Hospital. And thank you, Dr. Rajeshwar, for being with us. So now I invite our speaker for today's evening, Dr. Bharat Rekhi. Dr. Bharat, you can share your screen. He's trained in surgical pathology, including cytopathology. He's at present Professor, Department of Pathology, Tata Memorial Hospital, Mumbai. Today's his talk is going to be on the molecular classification of uterine cancers, and I thought it is something new. Not many of us are doing, not many of us are used to. So let's hear from Dr. Bharat. I invite also Dr. Tanka, Dr. Jitendra Bhatia, Dr. Chandra Mauleshwari, Dr. Ananda Marpandi, and also I invite Dr. Arun Dharmarajan to be a part of this panel. And thank you, Dr. Bharat. Please share your screen, take us through. Please have a very interactive session with the panelists. I hand over the mic to you as well as the screen. Please share your screen. Kashish, can you help in sharing the screen?
Bharat sir, any issue that you're facing?
No, is my screen accessible? Am I audible?
You're audible, you are visible, but screen is not seen. Please share
I
your
have put it on share.
Okay. Yeah.
Miss Himanshi, are you there? Can you
Yes,
just make sure?
As he's putting the screen, I request Dr. Rajeshwar Singh and also to Dr. Abhijit to few comments on uterine tumor classification. Either Dr. Abhijit.
Hello. Yes. Hello. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Abhijit. Please continue.
See, this is one of the more new things which is coming up. I think in the next few years, this will be one of the more useful methods, tools to diagnosis of a disease, especially uterine tumors like the endometrial tumors, where we can, by these molecular markers, we can surely get hold of the good prognostic, bad prognostic, and the intermediate prognostic disease, and we can also treat accordingly.
Okay, Dr. Rajesh was saying how much in your practice this uterine tumor class, uterine tumors include the endometrial tumors mainly, okay, and molecular classification.
It is quite common. Basically, now divided into low risk, intermediate risk, and high risk. Now, the low risk are those which do not contain the high risk, that is the clear cell serosal or carcinosarcoma, that is one. Grade 1 and grade 2 limited to endometrium, that is 1/2 of the myometrium with no LVI. And intermediate are grade 1 and 2, which are invading less than half of myometrium, that is 1A with LVI, or more than half 1B or 2, and grade 3 with less than half of myometrium involvement, that is 1A. So this is the intermediate risk, and the high risk are the rest, that is stage 3 and stage 4. Serous and clear cell carcinoma, and grade 3 for more than 1/2 of myometrium invasion.
Yeah.
So that is how they are divided into all the three, and there is intermediate is also high risk subsequently divided.
Yeah,
That
Dr.
is how.
One question back to you. In which of the, does your practice regarding radiation to endometrial cancer change with the new classification?
Miss Himanshi.
Yeah, can you, Dr. Bharat, please?
Yeah, Miss Himanshi.
Yeah, Dr.
It's
Abhijit,
not same.
in the meantime, we can discuss.
So I
while
email you, can you just
getting the slides. Dr. Abhijit?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Regarding the newer classification, yes, it is helping us to guide our treatment protocol so that we can treat the patient accordingly as per the risk stratifications.
Which one you will not tell, okay, this particular endometrial cancer does not need radiation after the surgery is over? What is your cutoff? T1, or how do you cut it off? Or everybody needs radiation?
No, it's a T1 tumor with no negative and having no other dangerous signs or symptoms like that, like LVI and all those. So for those patients, we can opt out for the radiotherapy and we can only go for wait and watch.
Yeah, but rest of them, even Dr. Rajesh was saying quickly, which of the patients of endometrial tumors will you advise for chemotherapy? Now, I think the chemotherapy scenario and endometrial tumor is much more widened.
Yeah, you see, intermediate risk, only radiotherapy is good enough, but as you go to high risk, only non-invasive 1A, that is serous and clear cell will be on observation, whereas beyond 1A, either radiotherapy or nowadays some people also give chemotherapy plus brachytherapy to the vagina itself. Now this is based on GOG 249 trial where and PROTECT trial. So in those cases, in high risk, radiotherapy combined with chemotherapy is given. Whereas in stage 3 and 4, it is basically chemotherapy followed by either a vaginal or external, but because their local recurrences are more, so generally brachytherapy is preferred in such.
Thanks, Dr. Bharat. We can see your slides. Please take us through. And thank you, Dr. Bharat. Please.
Thank you, Dr. Anita, for this wonderful initiative. It's really an honor to be here with such a excellent, prestigious faculty, the leading oncologists, and having the pathologist perspective here, I really congratulate you. And I'm here to speak on the assigned topic, that is uterine cancer, focusing on endometrial carcinoma from morphology to molecular classification. Next slide. These are on the whole uncommon tumors, but they're on the rise, and they form increased percentage of cases that are related to mortality in women. At TMH, we see about 154 cases, roughly about 100 to 200 annually.
Dr. Bharat, are you able to hear us? Hello, sir. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Yeah. So there's some network issue. So can I request you to please switch off your video because we're not able to hear you clearly, sir.
Okay, I will.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Surely.
Okay, Dr.
Is
Bharat,
it
please
okay?
continue. Yeah, it's good. You continue, doctor.
Yes. So I have to ask Himanshi to move the slide. Next slide, please. Because she's doing it from her side. Yes. So the formulation of a pathology correct and clinically viable question, that is what is the tumor, how it's going to influence the treatment, whether they can undertake or you all can undertake a non-surgical intervention for probably grade 1 endometrioid carcinomas or a surgical, and what kind of surgery, and also for adjuvant therapies including radiation and chemotherapy, especially for serous carcinomas or high-grade carcinomas. Then how will the tumors behave? We know that serous carcinomas and high-grade endometrioid carcinomas are more aggressive. Next slide. And that's the classification as pathologists we've been following, splitting endometrial carcinomas into endometrioid, a whole range of morphologic variants, including mucinous serous, which is aggressive, clear cell, mixed patterns, transitional, lumped with serous now. Next slide. And that brings me to first question. What are the essentials of surgical pathology report in endometrial carcinoma? And in the interest of time, I'll myself answer this. Next slide. So we look at, most importantly, two aspects, that is a gross and the microscopy. And in grossing, we look at the type of specimen in terms of the surgical procedure that has been undertaken, which is based on the clinical radiological staging. Then we look at the description of the growth, the tumor involvement, including the myometrium. We look at the lower uterine segment involvement of late, which is becoming more important. I'll share and show the importance of this particular parameter, along with the other documentation of the adnexia, the isthmus, vaginal involvement, lymph nodes are sampled, and we draw all the sections. Next slide.
Dr. Bharat,
microscopically,
panelist also, let them also
yes,
be.
yes,
We'll give you
I
time.
will.
Okay.
I will bring out to the, yes. So the microscopic description would include the differentiation in terms of the grade, which is based on architectural and nuclear, parameters. We grade FIGO 1, 2, or 3. Importantly, we look at the involvement of the myometrium, which is less than or more than equal to half, because it's, according to the ported trial, going to influence whether adjuvant RT is to be offered. Involvement of serosa is seen. LVI, which is a more aggressive parameter, involvement of the lower uterine segment that I alluded initially, and then the other parameters. Finally, looking at the tumor type and the TNM stage as per the AJCC classification latest. Next slide. And essentially what makes sense has been of, over the years is type 1 versus type 2, which you'll take as more favorable type 1, and then type 2 that are non-endometrioid or grade 3 endometrioid. And then we do come across mixed patterns. Now here's what I'd like to invite the pathologist in the panel. What is your experience related to, and how do you manage certain carcinomas endometrial which show as mixed patterns? Dr. Thanga, if you would like to answer, or any pathologist.
Yeah, it is routinely in HND, in our experience, we will be able to give the diagnosis. Mixed patterns are quite rare as far as I'm concerned in endometrial carcinoma. Like usually it's type 1 or type 2, we sign it out. Mixed patterns, carcinosarcomas, that is totally different entity. It won't come under the routine endometrioid carcinomas. And
so carcinosarcomas, yes.
Endometrial stromal sarcoma is a different entity. Mixed pattern with endometrioid, it's little rare.
True.
In my experience.
So yes, true, madam. So carcinosarcomas like MMMPs are oncologists inform us that they treat like carcinomas only because they behave. It's just that they're more aggressive. And what we see in mixed patterns sometimes when you're looking at more than one component. Next slide. Can we just move the next, Himanshi? When we look at components like, you have a serous which the oncologist is really looking for, and we say that this percentage, so at least 5% of any pattern what we see, we report. And the oncologist is looking for this is what we call as serous, which is again, like you said, very rare to see this admixture of endometrioid versus, with serous. And any of the component, aggressive, especially if it's grade 3 endometrioid or clear cell or serous, if it's more than 5%, we report that because these are aggressive parameters. So that's what our experience, is, but there is no cutoff basically to say something serious in a mixed pattern. That's kind of a challenge is what I thought I'll just bring it into. Next slide. And the second question, in your report, apart from the morphological features what markers do you like to include in preparing your report of an endometrial carcinoma? Madam, would you like to share your experience?
P53. Hello.
Yes, madam. Yes, madam. Please, please.
P53.
Okay.
And ER also we do, sir. In our institute, we do estrogen receptor also for all endometrioid adenocarcinomas, though NCCN does not recommend it till stage 3, stage 4 or recurrent endometrioid adenocarcinomas. And then P53 and P16, we use it only when there is a doubt if it is a grade 3, like if it's a serous carcinoma or a low grade endometrioid adenocarcinoma.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Chandra Mulleshwari. Very nice inputs, and thank you, madam. I'd like to ask the oncologists here what other markers, would they like to, because we have our oncologists who insist on certain markers that I'll share with you. And what are the other markers the oncologists are looking for? And P53 is definitely a very, very crucial marker. So any of the oncologists could take this is what they, additionally are looking for, apart from the morphological parameters that we enlist in our report.
Sometimes we do ask for receptor status when the patient is not fit for any other treatment like chemotherapy or radiation. We want to give them hormones. So in that kind of patients, we will ask for hormone receptors.
True. Thank you very much. Yes, madam.
Dr. Bhatia, please.
Yeah. In our setups, we definitely in IHC markers, we do ER, PR, HER2 also. And other molecular markers which are becoming important these days are P53 and polygene. We need to see whether there is mutation of polygene, and we also do MSI markers. So MSI, polygene, and TP53 are the common mutations which we look for.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Bhatia. That's pretty much, I think, our experience also.
MMR, MSI should be done in an HER to.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, Professor Singh. So, according to the NCCN guidelines, they are insisting now to do every case, of endometrial to be triaged for MMR. But we have a bit of a challenge. So, next slide, please. I'll just share with you our experience, what we do. Next slide. And that's a list of markers that we do generally. ER-PR we are doing routinely. Our oncologists insist on ER-PR in almost all endometrial carcinomas. P53 is very important, like Madam Dr. Thanga said. And it's important that we, describe the expression of this marker. We don't call it positive or negative. It has to be mentioned whether it's diffusely positive in more than 70% or completely absent. That is the mutation type expression of P53. If it's, and that's what we call as also abnormal staining pattern, which I think you relate to high-grade endometrioid, mostly serous carcinomas as oncologists. So focal P53 staining is a wild type expression. Then sometimes trying to differentiate endometrioid from serous high-grade, we don't have an experience, but people use loss of P10. Now MMR deficient, is being looked for in almost all, and NCCN guidelines insists on including all four. There is a paired loss of expression of MLH1, PMS2, or MSH2 or MSH6. But any of the loss of any single protein is also good enough. Then we use napsin A and hepatocyte nuclear factor. We don't have that, but these two, napsin A is a useful marker to see clear cell carcinoma, which again, I think as oncologists, you would like to know because it's a chemo refractory and a high grade, I think high risk kind of a subtype. And then we use P16, diffuse expression in serous carcinomas in endometrium when we are trying to differentiate from endometrioid high grade. Because P53 diffusely mutation type can come in both endometrioid also in serous. So P16 diffusely comes in serous carcinomas mostly. WT1 is useful to differentiate serous carcinomas of endometrium versus of the ovary, which can happen. So rarely you will see WT1 coming in the endometrial carcinomas. Mostly it is in the high-grade serous carcinomas. And like Dr. Bhatia said, that HER2/neu is the new kid on the block, and especially in serous carcinomas or aggressive carcinomas, cases are coming for being triaged for this particular marker. Next slide, please. So that's kind of a snapshot of the IHCs, and I will just bring in the point how this is useful as a surrogate to add to the molecular aspects. And there's been a clinical relevance, and I think it was in the introduction very rightly alluded by the esteemed oncologist that low grade or the type 1, which we've been stratifying, and next slide, please. Versus type 2. So type 1, we look for the the pattern 1 can undertake a non-surgical treatment that can be opted like high-dose progesterone therapy versus type 2 like serous clear and MMMTs, which are definitely aggressive, and there can be possibilities of including adjuvant CTRTs in type 2 serous especially. And then again, like I said, lower uterine segment involvement, because the MMR deficient tumors of late we've seen our experience and also mentioned in literature, the lower uterine segment involvement is associated with the MMRD deficient tumors. And the POTEC trial has shown the value of deep myometrial invasion to add adjuvant RT in cases of the endometrial carcinomas. And also there is an indication for nodal sampling during frozen section, which we get some requests when we're looking at the endometrial carcinomas in frozen sections. And then myometrial vascular invasion is an indicator for recurrence. So again, a aggressive parameter. Next slide. So that's kind of a snapshot of the clinical relevance of these the features and the morphological pattern. Just to share with you as a pathologist, I couldn't resist one of the slides to see. You can see that the very well differentiated endometrial adenocarcinoma, you don't see an invasion here, but you see back-to-back arrangement of these glands. If you can see these circles with the spaces, and very well differentiated pattern, no high-grade nuclear atypia. Next slide. And then you see this glands into this structures which are the muscles. That's called the myometrial invasion is what we are looking, which generally doesn't show up on a curetal specimen. Next slide. And that's more higher nuclear atypia, which we look and we call as something grade 2 or higher grade. You can see a lot of these black dots and dirty kind of things. So there are mitosis and there's higher nuclear atypia. Next slide. And then most of these differentiated or type 1 showed this diffuse ER expression. We've seen rarely type 1 or low grade showing focal ER, but they show in abundance the well differentiated or the endometrioid classically, the ER expression, that is a nuclear expression. Next slide. And that's what is the aggressive subtype. You'll see this very frond-like, fern-like pattern of these more aggressive cells. And you see here the diffuse expression of a marker called P53, what we just discussed. And that's what we call as a mutation type. You see almost all cells, more than 70%, strong dark staining. Or if it is completely absent, focal presence will, make it a wild type pattern. This is a high-grade serous carcinoma showing mutation type P53 expression. Next slide. So next question comes, what are the limitations, as oncologists, which you see come across? I put this question to all the oncologists. When you see reporting, in endometrial carcinomas, what are the challenges that you see come across, and, your pathologist is also trying to discuss with you? So any oncologist could take this question.
Dr. Rajeshwar and Dr. Abhijit, you can, Dr. J. Balaji is also here with us.
Hello.
Yeah, yes.
Hello. At times there will be some confusion in the grades. In some pathologists, they'll be reporting as grade 2, and somewhere they'll be coming with a report with grade 3. So there will be a confusion.
Yes. True. Any other queries? Yes, madam.
Any comment on pole mutation mutated cancers? I mean,
sir, I'm bringing that point. I'm just bringing that point, sir. Yes. But I thought it's good to know the the basic problems, and then how we allude further to bringing on to the mutation profiles. So I'll just bring in the point here. Next slide. the problems come. Next slide. Yeah, complex atypical hyperplasia versus the preceding one versus well differentiated endometrioid carcinoma. That's not a very big issue, because I think again you look for the high dose progesterone therapy. Grade 2 versus grade 3 is important. Low versus type 1 versus type 2. Grade 3 endometrioid versus serous, which a pathologist can have a problem. Then we've seen mixed patterns in endocervical versus endometrioid. Next line. Yes, so the limitations have been, with the morphological classification, that it's not very reproducible. Like very rightly said, some pathologists grade 1 to 2 could be, other pathologists grade 3. And we use P53 to pick up the high-grade endometrioid or the serous carcinoma. So there's a fair amount of inter-observer variability, which has been well recorded, and there's an imperfect reflection of the tumor biology. Next slide. And something which came to our rescue has been the TCGA, the Integrated Genomic Categorization of Endometrial Carcinomas, which stratifies tumors into 4 different types. That is the POL-E, the DNA polymerase epsilon catalytic unit, which is ultra mutated, and we identify POL-E mutations with sequencing. Then microsatellite instability, hypermutated type, which can be tested MSI, I would make a point here, by PCR and sequencing. And simultaneously, a good substitute is IHC, that is the MMR deficiency. So we look at the mismatch repair proteins at IHC, and we look at the microsatellite instability with PCR and sequencing. Then there is the copy number low, which is not specific for any mutation profiling, and then copy number high, which is the serous like P53 abnormal mutation, which can be again tested with IHC. Just showed you an example. So you can see, apart from these other 3 subtypes, it's the POL-E mutation. If you integrate with your IHCs, you can take care of this, the endometrial carcinomas, the molecular classification. Next slide. So this is just hot off the press, and I would invite any of the radiation colleague would like to comment on this particular paper that showed up in Journal of Clinical Oncology, telling the impact of molecular classification, of the PORTEC trial, especially in high-risk endometrial carcinomas, and the impact on prognosis. Anybody would like to take this, slide to share,
Dr. Ananda Selvakumar?
Yeah. Yeah, the PORTEC 4A is going to address both the clinical features as well as the molecular details. But we know when we analyze the PORTEC 1 and 2, when the tumor is more of POL mutated and the grade is 3, even with the grade 3, they won't recur actually. When we look into the details. But we can't take like all the POL tumors are good prognostic patients, because the chance of carcinosarcomas or undifferentiated tumors are also possible with POL mutated tumors. So we have to take much more time to get into those details.
True, sir. So with the PORTEC 3 trial, they looked at the high-risk endometrial carcinomas and which ones do better. And there was this number, this is just hot off the press in 2020, August Journal of Clinical Oncology, in 410 cases in which they found abnormal P53 in the high risk, but 23%. So otherwise it's serous make about 10%, clear cell make 5%, and high-grade endometrioid make 15%. So it's 25%, high risk. And in that, they found P53 abnormality, because you can see P53 abnormality in both endometrioid as well as in serous, which was in 23%. POLE came in 12%. Otherwise, the general POLE mutations are seen in 4.6 to 12%. That's a range of POLE mutations coming in endometrial carcinomas. And MMR deficient were 33% and not specific, that is a copy number low, were 32%. They found that irrespective of both the arms, when they were randomizing with the CTRT versus RT, POLE did better. POLE were better, and there was improved risk, free survival with adjuvant CTRT for P53 abnormal tumor. So it makes a lot of sense when we do P53 testing for our endometrial carcinomas, because adjuvant, they will do better with the adjuvant CTRT is what this particular trial showed versus the RT. And POLE, irrespective of both the arms, POLE positive tumors fared better. Next slide. So brings me to question number 4 of the requisition for molecular testing in endometrial carcinomas. What is the current status? Dr. Bhatia, I would like to have your views on this. So how are you getting the requisitions, and how are the clinicians also can add to this particular question?
Basically, we are not so far, if practically I talk about, what kind of requisitions we are getting. We are getting requisitions for wholly specific. They generally don't ask that you classify it, but we get requisitions for polygene. We get requisitions for TP53 and for MSI. As you rightly said, that because these are related to the prognosis and wherever the polygene is present, whether it is in endometrioid or non-endometrioid means type 1 or type 2 histopathology, the prognosis is better. So what we are getting as requisition is specifically for these genes, poly, TP53 and MSI.
And I think that perfectly covers the entire classification. So my question is like, so for the oncologists, do you like to triage all cases for molecular, or is there a selection in which, so how are the cases being triaged for molecular testing? Madam Dr. Anita and all the oncologists, how do you prefer, molecular testing in your, as a part of the report?
Our expert panelist is there, Dr. Rajeshwar Singh and Dr. Abhijit. You can take the question.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Basically, as a medical oncologist, only stage 3 and stage 4 cases come to us most of the time. Otherwise, the radiation oncologists are looking after these cases in adjuvant setting after the surgeons. So in those cases, what we are interested in these cases is, apart from the standard high risk classification, stage 3 itself is a high risk. In stage 4 and metastatic setting, we are more concerned of MSI, as well as where we can intervene apart from what standard treatment we are given.
Yes, sir. Sir, and you would like to know whether there is a serous component and the pathologist is added, because I think probably that influences your treatment. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
Serous, you have to treat aggressively. Clear cell, especially clear cell, is very, very bad disease. Recurrence rates are very high.
Dr.
Balaji here.
Dr. Balaji, yes, please. Yeah.
This is with regard to the current status, ma'am. I think molecular oncology with the TCGA classification is going to be the future. It has come even in the recent edition of DeVita, and I think that will be the future, like the way we deal with ERPR and have to go in making decisions on breast cancer, which was just initially a kind of thing which we can do, or you can choose to avoid. You can give tamoxifen just like that. That was the initial thought before it became the standard of care. I think that is the way endometrial cancer is going to go. But as clinicians, right now, what we'll be looking at is basically the stage of the tumor and the grade of the tumor on, making decisions on whether the patient needs adjuvant treatment in stage 1 and 2. Stage 3 automatically qualifies for chemotherapy and radiation. But absolutely right, ma'am, in that we should follow and do these tests like P53, the pole mutations and the MSI testing, so that the future can be, ready. Basically, we'll know whether to go for therapy or we can avoid therapy in such patients.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's the same sentiments our oncologists echo, and it's wonderful the way you wrapped it up. Next slide, please.
Comment.
So the challenges, I mean, I think we can share here the lab, I think from the pathology lab, the challenges in terms of, furnishing any immunohistochemical marker or the molecular technique is the feasibility and the resources, which might not be accessible across the country. And again, very important part is to look at the standardization of any IHC and regular quality checks, because that, influences your quality of the test results. Dr. Bhatia, would you like to comment on these two crucial points here?
Very rightly said, the resources and the quality of IHC and sequencing is very, very important. To us, most of the cases come after IHC is done in various labs. So what we get usually is for the molecular part. That's why how I said that we get these 3 mutations, that is MSI, TP53 and poly. So most of the cases which we get, IHC is done in the periphery because that is easily available, whereas sequencing is not that frequently available. But I feel now in our country, the availability is not a very big issue.
I agree with you. We are like a land of paradox where you have the Mercedes Benz and the elephant at the same time. So we do have access to all, and patients are looking for all the material, all the latest tests. But the issue that has been even internationally is the standardization of the IHCs. That's been a bit of a challenge to look at all 4 markers working good at all the time. So do you feel there should be a need for any referral laboratory which sort of can take care of tests and beat sequencing with the regular QC checks? I mean, I'm not promoting any lab particularly, but there could be where there is regular standardization, quality controls in check, and because it's going to influence be it the treatment or screening patients for Lynch syndrome for that reason. So do you feel, or any of the panelists would like to feel a need for any referral lab looking at the QCs and quality checks of these tests? Just a quick view or point.
Yeah, Dr. Bharat
Yes,
Rekhi and Tanga here. Not only for these markers, any markers, you will have regular internal quality check weekly. Then the external quality control, all NABL accredited laboratories will have all these things. You mean that, or some other thing specifically you want?
I think that's a perfect point, madam, you have brought in, because I think like we do any of the molecular tests, we participate in regular PT testing, be it with the CAP or the NABL. So I think that's what point I want to bring in here, that whatever tests we have, we should make sure that we are running regular QC checks to ensure a good quality, because we handle referral materials. So we all can have those difficulties related to the fixation and things like that.
Yeah, especially for outside samples, we do check with Vimentin first. If antigenicity is preserved only, then we can tell. If Vimentin is negative, all the other things we interpret with very caution. So that part also for referral samples we do.
Dr. Bharat,
and especially for molecular, the quality checks are very, very important. Availability of proficiency testing in our country for molecular, all the parameters is not that easily available, but CAP definitely has covers most of the.
So we do our molecular testing with CAP. That's what I think.
We also
very rightly.
do with we do with CAP. Of course, NABL is there, and we also do with CLIA, which is specific to America.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Dr. Bharat. We are running short of time. We have a lot of questions in the chat box. In fact, that is the way to go forward. We are just carrying on adjuvant therapy based on histopathology rather than molecular. And in over a period of time, all these markers which we have discussed today, POL, MSI, the other markers, P53 is going to take us way forward. And thank you, Dr. Bharat. Thank you to everybody. We had a good
discussion. Just to finish my slide, I have just one or two slides just to finish the the talk. I just run through in like 5 minutes to complete the whole thing. Next slide, please. Yes, so I think alternative to the molecular classification is this PROMISE study which showed up, and here you just need, with this, it has mentioned that you just need to do polymutation, and IHC can take the rest care of the other 3 subtypes. Like I just alluded to, P53, you can use a test by IHC, and again the MMR markers. But of course, you will have some discrepancies where you actually need to go for the gold standard, that is MSI testing. Next slide. Next slide. So that's kind of an alternative, and that's to share with you our experience of 50 MMR deficient, cases of endometrial carcinomas, which we tested by IHC. Next slide. And something which came importantly here in terms of the highlights was that we found that lower uterine segment involvement, high-grade, deeply infiltrative, heterogeneous EMACs, P53 positive and wild type are associated with the MMR deficient. So IHC does help in telling about, with the help of IHC, we can look at comparison of the morphological parameters to see whether this could be an MMR deficient tumor and what morphological features does it show. Similarly, for polymutations, we have certain morphological features which we can use as a trigger to test for polymutation, like you have the tumor infiltrating lymphocytes, or you have the relatively higher grade endometrial carcinomas. Next slide, which are not MMR deficient. Next slide. And that's to show with you the importance of lower uterine segment, which is marked here in this particular case of an MMR deficient tumor, simultaneously having an endometrial adenocarcinoma, type of adenocarcinoma in the ovary in this 36-year-old lady. Next slide. So this was an MMR deficient tumor. Next slide. And to share with you, I thought that probably I would have the pathologist perspective here, but just quickly sharing with you, you see this complete loss in the upper panel of MLH1 and PMS2, and you see this parallel MSH2 and MSH6 completely retained. So, and you see the controls within the, intervening lymphocytes in the upper two panels, you see this positive staining, whereas you see the complete tumor positive for MSH2, MSH6. So paired loss of MLH1 and PMS2 makes this tumor MMR deficient, and this tumor also had a clear cell component in the preceding slide that I showed you. Next slide. So just kind of coming to the conclusion for some takeaways, because we are not ordering in the restaurants these days. So I thought I should use the analogy of takeaways. Is the histopathology remains a gold standard, because we've seen grading and staging are very crucial parameters. We can't take away from that. It's important to timely integrate molecular results and classification, especially poly mutations, and to integrate IHC is a good substitute for the other, 4 subtypes, and focus on validation and quality related issues, be it IHC or molecular tests. Final slide. So there's been the timeless triangle where we integrate the oncologist, radiologist, and pathologist. Next slide. That's my favorite slide I like to put in present time. This is the new angle of the molecular pathology, and that's what makes it a complete gold standard. Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Bharat. Thanks for bringing us all together in a common platform. And it's not a discussed topic. We learned so much. In fact, I think we can have a whole evening with molecular pathology in ovarian uterine
Thank you so much.
And also, I
Thank you
appreciate all
very
your
much.
published, whatever the references you showed, they are all, you are the author. That was quite amazing. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for all
Thank
the
you,
good
madam.
work.
On to all the panelists. Thank you very much.
Stay on with us. Okay. Next, I invite Dr. Neeti Raizada. She's Director, Medical Oncology and Hemato-Oncology at Fortis Hospital, Bangalore. She was my colleague and also my friend. And I invite her to talk on the cervical cancer vaccine screening HPV. Over to you, Neeti. Kindly share your slides. I also invite Dr. R. Balaji, a surgical oncologist, Dr. Vandana Mahajan, radiologist, Dr. Sumati from nuclear medicine, and Dr. Paulami Mukherjee from the Northeast as a surgeon for our today's evening discussion. Over to you, Dr. Neeti. Take us through.
Good evening, ma'am. Thanks so much for inviting me today evening. Really appreciate it. I have a role as a speaker and a moderator. So what I'll try to do is, I know all of us are very well aware of this topic. All of us use it in routine practice. And there are not many learning lessons, but there's a lot of summary which we all need to discuss. So I'll be talking about cervical cancer vaccines and screening. And as I move in the presentation, I will ask my panelists to give their opinion. So I'll be talking about the magnitude of this problem, what are the risk factors briefly, and why prevention is plausible only in cervical cancer, not as much as other cancers, about vaccination, why, when, where, and of course, screening protocols. So what is the magnitude of problem? China and India constitute almost 35% of the global cervical cancer burden, which seems to be extremely huge, 1/3 of the entire problem, followed by Africa. India has the highest estimated number of cervical cancer deaths. This is an unfortunate number. And we know that every minute, one woman is diagnosed with cervical cancer across the world. And every 7 minutes, one Indian woman dies of cervix cancer. So cumulative incidence in Indian women is about 2.5%, and cumulative risk of death is about 1.4%. So I will start asking everybody, from the panel, that how often in our practice do we see cervix cancer as a problem? Dr. Paulami first, and then Dr. Sumati, Dr. Vandana, Dr. Balaji, and then Dr. Abhijit, please. In Northeast, Dr. Paulami, what do you think is the incidence, and how often do you have a patient of cervix cancer in your routine practice?
All right. Incidence in the Northeast is low as compared to the other parts of India. The current guideline by ICMR that has been published in July, that has said the incidence is about 14 in a lakh population, which is a little lower than the rest of the country. But the problem here is 80% of our patients present in stage or stage 3, stage 4 group. So that is the problem.
So you see a higher percentage of advanced cancer
Thanks,
in
Neeti.
practice.
Yep.
Okay. Dr. Balaji, you are
Locally
clinician.
advanced cancers.
Okay. So, Dr. Balaji, you are a clinician, and what is your, what is the kind of patient profile you see, and how often do you see cervix cancer in your practice?
Next to breast.
Good afternoon, Dr. Oh, sorry, which Dr. Balaji was this?
Dr. Balaji Ramani.
Balaji
Yeah,
and even
Dr.
Dr.
Balaji
J.
Ramani.
Balaji. Even Dr. J. Balaji, please give your comments. Both of you.
Yeah, Dr. Balaji Ramani here. So yes, as Polomi put it, like we do get a lot of cervical cancer cases, but in the past decade since I have been practicing, the numbers have come down. There aren't as many cervical cancer cases as there were before. Breast taking the precedence as far as females are concerned. And the numbers also reflect the same when you consider the incidence rates. And again, there is a shift in the patients who present to us. At one end of the spectrum, we have the early stage cancers or the pre-invasive cancers being diagnosed by screening, even in the lower socioeconomic groups. And on the other end of the spectrum, we do have the higher stage cancers coming in. So it is kind of like, we can say that as far as at least Chennai and South India is concerned, there is more of a shift towards the early stage cancers nowadays. We do come across the occasional bad cancers that we get with, a lot of parametric invasion, almost to the pelvic side wall and all. But for the majority, I would say it's shifting towards the early stage cancers, more common.
Dr. J. Balaji, sir is a professor at Government Medical College in Chennai. Large number of cases, sir, you will be seeing. Dr. J. Balaji, please, your opinion.
Yeah, as you rightly said, in the government setting, we get most of the cases are 3B cases. Yeah.
Right, sir. Actually, from practice in Bangalore also, we feel that, based on the practice, whether you're in a corporate sector or you're in Kidbai or a general hospital, the kind of patients who present to us is quite different. We definitely see more breast cancer, cervix cancer incidence in the past 1 decade has significantly come down. And what is interesting is that we are also getting a lot of Western type presentation. So we get a lot of uterine cancer and endometrial cancer as against cervix cancer now. And the cervix cancer who actually present in other hospitals generally would be advanced cancer, like stage 3B you mentioned, and sometimes stage 4. So, ma'am, Dr. Vandana, you are an oncopathologist. How often?
I'm an oncoradiologist.
Radiology. Oncoradiologist. How often do you see cervix cancer now as a total number of percentage of patients?
See, right now I'm practicing for doing MRI as well as the PET CT. So on an average in a week, I will be reporting say around 2 to 3. See, it's a tertiary referral center. You come for radiology investigation only once you've been diagnosed and everything has come. So still I get to see at least 3 to 4 PET CTs for either as follow-up. And in the new cases, I get to see, say 50% of these, 4 cases or 5 cases, out of which 2 to 3 are new patients in a week. So since ours is a referral center for the city, not the only center, but yes, a lot of patients do come from GH and all, and they are above 2. I hardly get to see early cancers. It's when you are referred for PET or for MRI, you are likely to have an advanced cancer, is what I get to see. Okay.
Dr. Sumati, your opinion?
So I work in tertiary care cancer hospital, dedicated cancer hospital. We in our practice see around 15% of gynecological cancers, of which around 6 to 8% would be about cervical cancers. And we mostly see patients stage 2B and above. Mostly they are locally advanced cervical cancers in our practice.
Okay. So moving to the risk factors, we know it is multifactorial, low socioeconomic status being a most important factor, multiple sexual partners, human papillomavirus, poor personal hygiene, and of course, HIV and STDs. So our focus remains human papillomavirus because we move from here to screening and also vaccination. This seems to be the necessary cause proposed for cervix cancer. It's a DNA virus with 8,000 base pair double-stranded circular DNA. It has 6 early genes which are involved in viral replication and 2 late genes which are involved in capsid formation. what we need to know is that 6.6% of all Indian women harbor cervical human papillomavirus infection in their entire lifetime. And the serotype 16 and 18 cause almost 77% of all cervix cancer. We talk about cure as oncologists, but we know that there is what exists is cure seems to be an erroneous target, and what exists is prevention. So when we talk about cervix cancer, we know it's a preventable cancer. Why? Because cervix mucosa goes through a series of changes and it takes several decades for full-blown carcinoma to appear. We here focus about primary prevention. Primary prevention is about educating people and of course about vaccination. Secondary prevention is about screening and early diagnosis. This whole concept of viral induced carcinogenesis, that is oncogenic carcinogenesis, came by Sir Harold Hosson. This was way back in 2008 when he won the Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology for diagnosing oncogenic viruses in general and human papillomavirus in particular for cervix cancer. So human papillomavirus has high-risk strains and low-risk strains, and low-risk strains cause genital warts, as we all know, but high-risk strains, which are strain 16, 18, 31, 33, 45, 52 and 58 are associated with cervix cancer. These cause persistent infection, precancerous lesion, and causally associated with cervix cancer. So to all my panelists, how often do people approach us for vaccination? When do we recommend? Which patient subset do we recommend? And how do we give such vaccination? Can I start with clinicians? Dr. Balaji first, Dr. Balaji Ramani, and then Dr. Balaji J.
Yeah, Nikki. So this question is a very important one. As you said, like prevention is always better than cure. And here, the role of vaccination I'd probably say there are only two cancers in the world today which are preventable by a vaccine. One is, your hepatocellular carcinoma, which has already shown the way. When you have HPV vaccination, being done in the Southeast Asia, you have had a reduction in the number of cancers almost by, half. And the same way we can see this in cervical cancers because, as you rightly pointed out, 16 and 18 are the causative factor in almost 70% of cervical cancers in today's world. That being the case, so always we should go for cervical cancer vaccination. And I, for one, am actually a proponent for including it in the national immunization program for everybody. So it should be between, in the pediatric age group when you catch them young and you can give it to them without any issues. Now there is a problem with the morality and all those things which are associated with this, but setting apart all that, being a part of the national immunization program is the way forward. Which vaccine? Again, ideal one is probably going to be the more the number of high-risk strains you cover, the better it is. But so far, we do not have any data which suggests that either the Cervarix, which has got only the 2 vaccines, and then you got the Gardasil 4, which was the initial one which was introduced, or the Gardasil 9, which has recently come up. I believe not yet available in India, which covers almost all the 7 high-risk types. But even then, trials have not really shown a difference in the incidence of cervical cancer so far. So any of the 3 should do. And who should be vaccinated? The current guidelines go between 9 and 26 with an extension for people who are HPV negative on co-testing. You can carry on. There are some people who say even up till the age of 45, suppose they are HPV negative, still you can vaccinate, though the age is still beyond that. But 9 to 26, definitely yes. And when to give? Current recommendation is, I would say, less than 14 years, 9 to 14 years. As I say, catch them young. And current guidelines of WHO say that only 2 doses are enough compared to the characteristic 3 doses which were advised previously. So less than 14 years is going to be 2 doses, 0 dose and 6-month or 3-month dose. And more than 14 years is going to be 0, 2 and 6, which is the classical schedule. And there have been studies in Africa where they could actually give only 1 dose of the vaccine and still that gave nearly a 70% protection, or in some cases even up to 90% protection. So that is again one thing, maybe a single dose vaccine, maybe something that may come in the future. And how, as I already mentioned, the best way is to go ahead and include it in the NIP, the National Immunization Program. But currently what I say to all my, patients, whoever it is to get them vaccinated whenever they have a girl child.
Right. So, sir, you are trying to say that we would not recommend it for boys.
Boys comes the next discussion. Currently I'm talking about cervical cancer alone, but yes, there is currently some of the data which is coming up that in, anogenital cancers, the last terminology which has come up, which includes all the lower anogenital tract under this. So boys, yes, that is going to be, but when you compare the incidence of anal cancers and the causative factors, then that is confined to a very high risk subset when compared to cervical cancer, which is going to be like every woman is going to be exposed in her life to HPV at least once. So that way, definitely for girls, it is a must. Boys, I'll be probably more selective in advocating it to everyone.
Thank you, sir. So, Dr. Bharat J, sir, do you see people coming to you for vaccination, or how does it work in your hospital settings?
Vaccination is a theory in the government setting. We hardly see any case earlier than parametrial inversion. We get cases only with cervical cancer with parametrial inversion. So vaccination is a theory.
Okay, Dr. Balaji, is the vaccine is not available in government hospitals?
No.
Okay, not available. So, okay, so that's in the government sector. Quick question also to Dr. Arun Dharmaraj and Dr. Ganesh Venkatraman. Dr. Balaji, you heard saying one of the vaccine is not available. So are we making the vaccines? What is Bharat Serum? And India is known to be the vaccine manufacturers. So where are we?
No. Only the non-available vaccine, the Gardasil 9, which has come up last year, only that is not available, ma'am. Gardasil, the original Gardasil and Cervarix are freely available in India, ma'am. Gardasil 9, I think, is due. I think probably because of the COVID outbreak, it was not available this year.
Okay, Niti, let's just continue. I wanted to ask one question.
Why vaccination of HPV is important? We have to understand that without vaccination, the options are less. The recommended options include abstinence and lifetime mutual monogamy. There's no clear evidence that barrier method, including condoms, confer protection against HPV. This seems to be an interesting note. Except for genital warts, by and large, the infection is asymptomatic and therefore remains undetected. Even in the Western world, even in the United States, the published literature says there's poor adherence to routine screening protocol. And of course, in a country like ours, there are no definite screening guidelines. Procedures like LEEP, that is loop electrical excision procedure, also has obstetric morbidity, including cervical stenosis. Now, why is it feasible to make HPV vaccine? There are viral-like particles, and the viral-like particles are the ones which can be used for vaccination. There's expression of L1 protein, which is used for recombinant DNA technology. And this confers high level of antibody and protection lasts for 10 years and even beyond 10 years. So what are the current recommendations? Poulomi, would you want to discuss about the recommendation and how we use them in clinical practice? Dr. Poulomi?
Hi. Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you are.
All right. So, yeah, this is the ideal age group is between 9 to 12, but in India, you can have, if people have missed it during that pediatric age group, it's extended to 26. So the two, the Cervarix and the Gardasil is the vaccines that's available. And the doses are, for Cervarix, you have 0, 2, and 0, 1 and 6 months, and Gardasil is 0, 2, and 6 months, the 3 doses. These are the instructions for vaccination basically is, first of all, these are IM injections, and therefore the thing is you have to tell them about the pain. See, the common causes, the common side effects would be definitely pain, maybe fever, maybe, because in the studies, some of the side effects, less common side effects would have been fever or flu, pain in the administered areas. The Cervarix has received some bad press in the past because of some incidences that has taken place, I think in a group of study where 4 of the girls had died. But then this has to be clarified that this was not due to the vaccine. So first of all, the guardians, if it's a pediatric patient, the parents should know that these are very safe vaccines, and there is absolutely no report of case fatality post these vaccinations.
Yes.
That's about it. Thanks.
So a question to Dr. Abhijit Sarkar. Sir, what are the normal instructions when we give when a person is getting vaccinated?
Sorry for me, it's difficult to say because I'm a radiation oncologist. It doesn't come to me, it goes to the gynae oncology.
No problem, sir. I will quickly summarize. I'm sure we are short of time. So almost 80 to 90% will have some kind of local reaction like pain and swelling, which Poulomi mentioned. 10 to 20% will have fever. This should generally be given in a lying down position because there is a small incidence of syncope. And we should probably observe for 15 minutes. There are no serious adverse events reported throughout the world. There was misconception and wrong reporting by the media, and therefore it was hit big time in our country. And what we have to understand is that pregnant women are the only category in which we have to avoid this vaccination. But if at all the patient is vaccinated, it does not require a medical termination of pregnancy. It can be given during lactation, and the woman can still continue breastfeeding. So as everybody mentioned, the doses are 3 doses, 0, 2, and 6 for quadrivalent vaccine, and 0, 1, and 6 for bivalent vaccine. There's no recommendation of booster. And for a young child, intramuscular injection in deltoid or anterolateral thigh can be given. So quickly moving to the screening section. What are the commonly practiced methods in our clinical practice? Dr. Vandana and Dr. Sumati, will that be okay to ask this question to you?
For me, people, once the clinical examination has been done by the physician, the best method is right now is to screen them with an ultrasound. Okay, ultrasound is a very good modality to pick it up. You can go ahead with the pelvic ultrasound, a transvaginal ultrasound also, or in the conditions where it is not available, in fact, a transabdominal ultrasound with a properly distended bladder can adequately pick up your cervical growths. And also relatively local staging can also be done, and at least the abdominal scan will pick up your nodal spread if it is there. So that's how I will do this for the screening.
Dr. Sumati?
So before the imaging comes into picture, routine screening using pap smear, that is a clinical gynecological examination with pap smear on a routine screening basis, and HPV antibody testing, following which then the local staging, the primary staging of the disease as and when it turns out to be invasive carcinoma cervix is diagnosed, then the role of imaging comes into picture.
That's what I said, clinical examination and this thing, and then my role comes.
I agree with you, doctor.
Then the radiological examination. Yeah. So basically we start with physical methods, which includes gynecological examination, visual inspection, and then move to pap smear and HPV testing. So what are the common methods of visual examination? We use either 3 to 5% acetic acid. We use visual inspection with magnification, or we can use Lugol iodine. Various studies have shown that most of these tests are very good, and there's no superiority of one over the other. Pap smear is sampling of the cervix, which involves the cervical surfaces. What is very important to understand is when you're taking a sample, it should be in the transformation zone. That is the zone at the junction of ectocervix and the endocervix, which is known as the transformation zone. The specificity of this test is almost 94%, and the sensitivity is around 75%. So liquid-based cytology has a little bit of superiority. It increases the sensitivity by about 12% as compared to just doing a pap smear. This is also, by taking a liquid-based cytology, this sample can also be used for HPV DNA. Now, Poulomi, can you tell me how often do we do HPV DNA testing in our practice? I mean, in your setup.
All right. Now, among the various modes of screening that you have just mentioned, Dr. Neeti, there's a different pap smear by HPV, which is a screening method that we use when we do the opportunistic screening. Patients who come to the hospital with mild symptoms or just anxiety for the anxiety regarding the disease. The visual inspection methods are generally preferable if you're going to do the population-based screening. Right. Now, in my practice, I have we have just started doing HPV testing. This is on a population based because we have we have this screening program from the hospital in lieu with ICMR. In this program, we were initially looking at VIA, we were doing the VIA testing, and as a triage, picking up patients from the group which test for abnormal findings on VIA, and patients doing the pap smear testing. But for the last 2 to 4 months, or a little before that, we had introduced HPV testing. So in my practice, it's a very recent thing because of the cost issues. And pap smear I have done for the patients who have come to the hospital. Regarding the timing of pap smear, I would say it can be done anytime. Even if the patient is menstruating, you can actually take a pap smear. Instructions for a pap smear for the patient, I'm not very stringent on instructing the patients for a time, because if they go back, the problem getting them again, recall is issue here. But when I'm doing the test, there are certain things I would like to see is, I would like to clean the cervix, because the hygiene is an issue in this area. And many times you have a lot of vaginal flora, that bacteria that gets in or contaminates. So the first thing I do is I clean the area with a gauze, and then as instructed with an R spatula, we don't have the liquid based pap smear, it's just air dried smear that's used. It's a classical pap smear thing that we use. Thanks,
Right.
Niti. Yeah.
So what are the timing and instruction of pap smear? Let me quickly summarize. Do not douche. That is an instruction which is given to the patient. Do not use tampon. Do not use birth control foams, medicine, cream, jelly, or lubricant just prior to pap smear. It should not be done when there is an active vaginal infection. Abstinence for 24 hours is recommended. And pregnancy happens not to be a contraindication. It can be done in a pregnant woman, and it can also be done when the patient is postpartum within 6 to 8 weeks of delivery. And of course, the best timing, if it is feasible, is between day 8 and day 20 of the menstrual cycle. So about the HPV testing, generally it is done by 2 assays. One is a PCR-based generic primer, and then the hybrid capture 2 assay, which is more prevalent now in our clinical practice. Hybrid 2 capture assay is a batch test, and it has 2 probes. The probe A is for low risk HPV types, that is 6, 11, 42, 43, and 44. And probe B is for high risk subtypes. At this juncture, the international recommendations are, and we tend to follow these recommendations, pap smear only every 3 years. If pap smear and co-testing of HPV is done, then it should be between every 5 years, between the age of 30 and 65. HPV testing, if it is high risk, if the results are high risk, then it has to be repeated every 3 years. Now, quick points about why should we start at 21 and why should we stop at 65. We know that it takes a while for this infection to appear, and most HPV infections are transient and reversible. So transient infection may not lead to cancer, and therefore it is important to wait for spontaneous regression of such cancers. 1 to 2 per million only will transform into malignancy eventually. And repeated screening can also cause cervical stenosis and cervical incompetence. Why to stop at 65? We know that HPV contraction beyond 65 is very limited. It can be about 5 to 10 years, and at that point, HPV does not complete its life cycle. What is an adequate screening? 3 consecutive negative pap smear is called as an adequate testing, in which the further testing can be delayed or stopped, or 2 consecutive negative HPV testing. Now, what is the benefit of co-testing? HPV, interestingly, HPV capture hybrid assay also happens to be a surrogate marker for non-squamous cell type like adenocarcinoma, which is a very unique thing for HPV testing, and therefore very relevant in our setting. We have right now the data which shows that adenocarcinomas in Indian subsets are increasing as compared to squamous cell carcinoma, and these sometimes remain undetected when we do pap smear. So do we need to screen in vaccinated individual? At this juncture, the answer is yes. And for all vaccinated individuals also, the same guidelines are followed as for non-vaccinated individuals. So when do we do pap smear? Pap smear starts at 21, stops at 65. A co-testing is recommended. If pap smear is positive, we would still vaccinate that individual, because vaccination may help in other serotypes. If pap smear is negative, vaccination is definitely recommended, at least till 26 years of age, and optional between 26 and 45 years of age. What is the proposed management for women over 30? If cytology is negative but HPV testing is positive, then we would recommend repeat of HPV testing at 1 year. And if HPV testing of high risk is positive, these are low risk. If high risk HPV strains like 16 and 18 are positive, immediate colposcopy is recommended. So thanks so much. Thank you, Anita ma'am. I hope I did not cross the time limit to a significant.
Niti, that was very informative, and hardly we discuss all these points, and I'm sure a lot of us have taken a huge number of take-home messages, because at this point we have more than 100 participants who have joined us. Thank you, Niti, very much. Thanks. If Dr. Abhijit wants to give few comments before we move on to the next talk. Dr. Abhijit.
Yes, thank you, Niti, for an excellent presentation. And I think HPV vaccination is for the primary prevention of carcinoma cervix. And it should come in our national immunization program, especially between 9 and 6, and more specifically for between 9 and 14 years of child. But a cost effectiveness second generation HPV vaccine is unmet need for developing countries like us. But this such time, secondary prevention through periodic cervical cancer screening will be in place to use the existing infrastructure and the cost effectiveness of the screening, such as the pap smear and HPV DNA tests. As there is no risk of getting an HPV infection from the vaccine, as the vaccine does not contain a live virus, and HPV vaccination and regular screening, cervical screening, is the most effective way to prevent the cervical cancer. And we also require more awareness so that the more and more people go for the vaccine and the taboo has to be taken out. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abhijit. Thanks for the nice note. Thanks to everybody. Moving on to the next topic, ovarian cancer newer treatment. I request Dr. Ram Abhinav, who is a consultant in Kovai Medical Center at Coimbatore, to take us through the speaking as a speaker and a moderator. I also invite Dr. Bhabesh Poladia, Dr. Kripa Shankar, even Dr. Rajeshwar Singh to be in the panel. I also, Dr. Bharat Rangarajan and Dr. Ghanasham Bishwas is also with us. Want you to join the panel. Thank you very much. Please, Dr. Ram, please take over.
Thank you, madam. Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible. Your screen, please. Dr. Kripa, Dr. Bhabesh, welcome. Even Dr. J. Balaji can also continue. Dr. Rajeshwar Singh. Yes, please. Please start.
Thank you. So today we have an excellent panelist. Today I'll be talking about the ovarian cancer and the newer treatments. So because of lack of time, we'll go fast. So cutting short the history. So it's a 35-year-old lady who's married and has 2 children, presented with abdominal distension and pain since 2 months. Was evaluated and she had typical ovarian cancer picture with bilateral ovarian masses, peritoneal lumental deposits, and mild ascites. HRCT thorax was normal, CEA was high, and CEA was low. Very suggestive of ovarian cancer. Peritoneal fluid cytology was positive for malignancy, and peritoneal fluid cell block was suggestive of Mullerian origin. So the diagnosis is ovarian cancer stage 3, and she has other important history and other comorbidities. That is, we have very healthy attenders and we have a lot of vitamin M toxicity with her. And mother had breast cancer, and our sister is a medical oncologist in USA, but the performance status is 0. And she wants to take treatment only with you. So Dr. Bhavesh, question, is there any additional tests you want to do for this patient?
I would like to do a BRCA mutation for her. That is the only, I think, additional test I would like to do.
Okay. And Dr. Kripa, you want to do any other investigation apart from BRCA?
I would agree with Bhavesh there. I think BRCA testing is now mandatory for anybody with an epithelial ovarian cancer. So I think I would definitely want to contemplate doing a BRCA testing.
Dr. Akila, do you want to do any other test for this patient? You want to add on something?
I think Dr. Akila has not joined. Dr. Rajeshwar Singh is there. Dr. Bharat Rangarajan, Dr. Ghanasham Vishwa. You can invite them.
Dr. Bharat Rangarajan, you want to do any other test for this patient?
Yeah, Ram, probably if I can quickly add, since you said, her sister is a medical oncologist in the US, probably HRD as well, along with, the whole entire panel as well, because, they have an excess of vitamin M as well. So definitely, yes.
So this is what the latest recommendations are. It is quite rapidly changing. So BRCA testing is mandatory, and we should also consider HRD testing. It may not be feasible in India at all, but as far as the panel is concerned, you have to do an HRD testing by some other means. And do you want to do a germline BRCA alone, or you want to add up somatic BRCA as well?
So again, I'll take that. If I can tell you a little bit more about that. Now, Astra has rolled out this T-BRCA or tumor BRCA testing. So the only drawback with doing a tumor BRCA is that you won't know whether it's actually a germline or somatic, but your pickup rates will definitely be higher. Because when you talk about BRCA, about 15 to 20% will have a germline mutation, and another 8% can have somatic mutations, and another 20 to 25 can have homologous recombination deficiency as well. So ideally, yes, I would definitely want to do a T-BRCA, and if that is positive, then probably you can go on and do a germline testing as well to see whether it's germline or somatic.
Dr. Arun Dharmarajan, is there any specific type of BRCA testing? Because there are multiple methods of testing BRCA. You would choose on any specific method of testing BRCA?
Yeah, Dr. Rajeshwar, you can take that question.
By NGS, at this moment, the best result we are getting by the Foundation One BRCA testing. And they are doing for all panel LOH. They are doing the HRR, other that is RAD51 and PAL2. PAL2 is not important in ovary, but other they are doing. So that is the best panel at this moment.
Thank you. Question to Dr. Bhavesh is, would you do BRCA testing alone, or would you do a comprehensive family gene mutation for all patients?
Practically, BRCA mutation alone I would like to do.
You want to do only BRCA mutations. And Dr. Kripa Shankar, you want to do the comprehensive panel, or you want to just do the BRCA mutation?
So again, just another point, doing a BRCA testing, I would do it on an NGS, and along with it, I would also do an MLPA as well. Because we all know that large insertions and deletions can be missed on an NGS. So ideal way would be to do both an NGS and an MLPA, which is a multiplex ligation dependent probe assay as well. And since you said, this patient has got a lot of vitamin M, and his sister is a medical oncologist again in the US, I would definitely contemplate doing a HRD assay, which obviously is being done by Myriad Diagnostics in the US as well. So yes.
Okay, then we'll move on to the next question. And to complicate things, the patient is germline BRCA positive. And as usual, as medical oncologists, we refer to the gynec surgeon to decide whether surgery is possible or not. And question number 3, leaving aside the surgeons, because they always want to operate, would you consider neoadjuvant chemotherapy for this patient? Or you want to consider upfront surgery for this patient?
I think if my surgeon is happy doing the surgery and very sure of doing an R0, surgery would be first. If not, then definitely neoadjuvant therapy should be given.
Dr. Kripa, you have any inputs for that?
So again, I would definitely go with neoadjuvant in this setting, because you're talking about somebody with extensive omental disease, peritoneal deposits, extensive stage 3C. Based on whatever you showed us. So we have data from the EORTC, the CORUS, the Horizon, and the Scorpion studies, which have actually shown that neoadjuvant chemotherapy may not have shown us improvement in survival, but your resectability rates, your R0 rates go up, and there is lesser complications, post-op complications are lesser. So based on that, I would definitely do neoadjuvant here.
Sure. Okay.
One point I want to add, this CA125 is very high. That is also one indication that you should give neoadjuvant.
Sure. But yes. So, and we know that we have an whole trial which says that what Dr. Kripa mentioned, that it is in a randomized setting, it is considered to be still equal. And there is a recent analysis. We cannot say it is confirmatory. It's a pooled analysis of 36,000 patients. And what that shows is patients who underwent primary cytoreduction, their outcomes were far better than patients who had NACT rather than primary cytoreduction. Again, the point is that this is not a randomized trial, and there might be a potential bias in patients who are taken for upfront surgery, but probably if the surgeon says, probably we'll have to agree to the surgeon. Probably surgeon feels that the disease can be taken out safely, then probably the patient should undergo primary cytoreduction, and both the points are taken. So the patients undergo primary cytoreduction. The patient is happy, the doctor is happy, and it is an optimal cytoreduction. You're also happy. So now the question is, would you consider intraperitoneal chemotherapy for this patient? Surgeon is asking you on the operating table.
I think if it is feasible, yeah, if it is feasible and patient is willing for that, definitely I think that would be a good option to it. But obviously, I mean, it comes with a lot of toxicity. So, I mean, at an experience center, probably yes.
Yes. Dr. Kripa, do you feel that intraperitoneal chemotherapy has an advantage over IV chemotherapy?
I mean, like based on the data, if you look at the GOG 172 study, which has actually shown a 17-month improvement in overall survival. But the major limitations with that study are, even in the context of a clinical trial, only about 40% of patients went on to complete all the prescribed cycles of intraperitoneal chemotherapy. And again, as was rightly pointed out, the complications, especially the port site infections and all, I mean, like that's the major, hindrance towards actually doing it in clinical practice. But yes, probably in a very fit patient, if at all, because
so this patient is 35 years old, vitamin M, medical oncologist, etc., etc. Would you still want to do?
Yeah, so I mean, I would definitely discuss that as an option with the patient, and definitely offer them that.
That's what even the evidence says. We have two big trials, GOG 172 and GOG 242. So GOG 172 was a positive study, at least for the progression-free survival. And the other GOG study was not a positive study, but it was a mixed bag, because in every arm, bevacizumab was there, and the PFS difference was not. It was not different. The GOG 172 showed an improvement in PFS, whereas the other trial did not show any improvement in the progression-free survival and the overall survival. There are differences between the dosing, and there are differences between the trial design. And bevacizumab, we all know that we don't know whether it works or not, but it's been there in all the arms. So in the present setting, probably can conclude that if IP chemotherapy cannot be given, should bevacizumab should be given for the patient? So
if I may, just one word as a surgical oncologist here, if I may just, can I, Dr. Balaji
sure.
here? Yeah, this is something which I've all long felt the need to say, because we have had 3 major randomized trials in intraperitoneal chemo, all of which showed benefit, in spite of the fact that IP chemo was not completed. As Dr. Kripa mentioned, it's only about 40 or 50% who completed, and still it managed to show a survival difference. That clearly points that it is beneficial. I understand the practical implications of having difficulty in giving chemo in all kinds of setup, like the way we give IV chemotherapy. But I think where it is available, definitely there is no question on the value of it, because if I give a treatment which is supposed to be given, and it is given only in 50% of patients, and it still shows an overall survival improvement, I think there is a clear indication that it works.
Yeah, just a point, Ram. So, I mean, like if you look at all these, intraperitoneal chemotherapy studies, there was always a day 8 chemotherapy that was given. So, you're talking about a dose-dense chemotherapy regimen that was given for all these studies. And then when cisplatin was substituted with carboplatin in the GOG 252, we could not actually show any improvement in survival as well. So it's only the GOG 172, and then in the first line setting, you have the OV-HIPEC study, the Dutch study, which looked at CRS plus HIPEC in that setting. So I mean,
OV-HIPEC was again not in the primary setting; it was in the interval setting, sir. It was not in the primary
this discussion
setting.
will just go on. This has been there, so we'll just move on to the next setting. So probably in patient.
In R0 resection, I don't think you like to give bevacizumab. No advantage in that when R0 resection is there.
Okay, so we have an interesting data from the GOG 172, and they say that the BRCA positive patients are the one who had the highest improvement in the progression-free survival. So probably this patient is also BRCA, and it makes sense because cisplatin works better in BRCA positive patients. So probably we can consider, the debate is still open. There is no still definite randomized evidence to say that dose-dense chemotherapy or adding bevacizumab and compared with intraperitoneal chemotherapy, there is improvement in intraperitoneal chemotherapy. But we can always consider in patients who are fit and who are BRCA positive and who are optimally cytoreduced. Is that point well taken everywhere?
Yeah, Ram, just another one, just a single point. So the thing is, I think this would have been done in the prior PARP inhibitor era. So now that we have PARP inhibitors, we have approved PARP inhibitors even in the first line for somebody with BRCA mutation. I think that also will definitely play a key role.
Yeah, that debate is still open, and we don't know what will add, what intraperitoneal cisplatin will add to BRCA mutation. That is always there. So that we don't know. So what we got from this is in BRCA positive patients, IP chemotherapy probably added some benefit, at least in that subset population. So patient underwent, did not undergo IP chemotherapy as usual. You convince them to take only IV chemotherapy, and she completed 6 cycles of paclitaxel and carboplatin 3 weekly. Now, would you consider maintenance therapy for this patient? She is germline BRCA positive. So the options are olaparib, niraparib, olaparib plus bevacizumab, bevacizumab alone, pazopanib, indatinib, or any other. What do you want to suggest as a maintenance? Or you don't want to give maintenance as such?
Maintenance therapy is approved now. Olaparib is approved as per the SOLO-1 trial. As per POILER trial, bevacizumab is not given bevacizumab to this patient during the initial treatment. So in that case, it is not valid in this. So olaparib or niraparib can be given without BRCA, with BRCA positive. Rest, we are not giving VEGF to this patient, so we can. That is only one thing at this moment we should do.
And Dr. Bhavesh, what is the agent? Because the patient is in front of you, she is germline BRCA and has all the money, everything, whatever you can, and she has the following, or you have the following options. What would you choose?
Here, I think the choice will be olaparib because it is available in India, and since bevacizumab
and she can import all the drugs.
So I think there is no head-to-head trial whether olaparib is better than niraparib or pazopanib or nintedanib. I think there is no head-to-head trial, but what we have for olaparib is SOLO-1 trial. So definitely for that advantage, we would like to use olaparib. If bevacizumab was used initially, then probably olaparib plus bevacizumab would have been a wonderful maintenance.
Okay, Dr. Kripa, you want to?
Olaparib and bevacizumab, why not? Continuation of bevacizumab beyond progression and add the PARP inhibitor.
Ma'am, it was not used in initial therapy, so that's why. Otherwise, if it was used as per ICON 7 or GOG, then probably olaparib plus bevacizumab have been a good maintenance.
Dr. Kripa, you want to add something? You want to give a different drug?
No, I would definitely agree with what all my other panelists have said. Olaparib, based on the SOLO-1 study, I mean, like you're looking at least 2 years of continuing olaparib. The only thing is niraparib, I mean, like based on the PRIMA study, that's also an approved agent, but you'll have to continue it for three years. Niraparib. And see, I mean, like I believe that the magnitude of benefit is definitely much higher in somebody who's BRCA mutant. So I would definitely offer them a PARP inhibitor. Definitely olaparib would be my choice.
One quick question to other panelists, all the panelists here. Like we find that NCCN also defines pazopanib in this. So if the patient were BRCA negative, then would you consider pazopanib as an alternative toxicity wise? Which would you prefer? Would it be the PARP inhibitors or would it be pazopanib?
Just to clarify, if I can tell you that, so pazopanib is not actually FDA approved. NCCN just gives it as a recommendation. So, but it's not FDA approved. Whereas bevacizumab is the approved VEGF agent that we have for them as far as maintenance therapy is concerned, and that's based on 2 large studies called the GOG 218 and the ICON 7.
218 and the ICON 7.
Yeah,
I get
correct.
it, but I'm just thinking it loud because Why did it come in the recommendation? That is the only question that I had with regard to, post-remission therapy, only these therapies are approved. That is why.
Yeah, the recommendation is based on AVO trial, which they have used not in primary, but only in maintenance. And there was only improvement in the PFS. And
PFS.
there
So
is
OS
no
data is
improvement
still
of,
not mature.
yeah.
So we'll move on from that. So we don't want it so simple. So at the end of surgery, the patient asks, so she is germline BRCA, and you have an option of PARP inhibitors and bevacizumab. So now, after surgery, do you want to suggest bevacizumab along with chemotherapy, or you just want to complete the chemotherapy and go ahead with PARP inhibitors? Dr. Krupashankar?
Yeah, I would continue the chemotherapy, finish 6 cycles of chemotherapy, and then put her on PARP inhibitors.
So you don't like bevacizumab. Okay, Dr. Bhavesh, do you want to go at the same regimen, or you want to add bevacizumab and give olaparib with bevacizumab and go on? Or you want to just stick to oraparib, niraparib?
I think what Dr. Krupa said, that chemo followed by olaparib would be an option here, because if there was an R plus resection or it was a stage 4 disease, probably it would have made more sense in adding bevacizumab.
So can I have the surgeon? So what is your preference? What do you think would be better in this setting? Would you consider, if the patient was primarily your patient, would you consider them to giving BRCA, the PARP inhibitors alone, or giving the bevacizumab?
No, you're talking about immediate post-surgery or after the first line of chemotherapy?
The patient underwent a complete cytoreduction, and now the patient is stage 3. And now, it was your primary patient. You have to decide, because medical oncologists, you don't give so much importance now. So what do you counsel? Now, PARP plus bevacizumab or only PARP?
I would probably, it goes both ways. We do not have currently evidence for saying one is better than the other. PFS is there with the bevacizumab if it is included in the initial therapy. So what I would counsel the patient in such a setting is, like, I will tell them, go and meet the medical oncologist, listen to both sides of the argument. You have a sister who is sitting in the US, then base your decision based on that.
I think
practically,
moderator and panelists are very happy listening.
No, that is a real scenario. I am giving you a real life scenario actually. I will just leave it in such a scenario where there is no clear benefit either way. I will just leave it to the discussion of the medical oncologist and the patient to discuss the pros and cons.
That is excellent. So we have multiple options. One is olaparib, niraparib, or giving bevacizumab plus olaparib. And if the patient is non-BRCA, then Dr. Bhavesh, what would you consider? The patient is not BRCA positive, and she got myriad testing done. So tumor is sent, it is not somatic BRCA. Everything is negative. Would you consider PARP inhibitors? That is, we know that niraparib is still approved in this setting. In this patient, would you consider bevacizumab or niraparib?
Niraparib would be a good choice.
You want to consider niraparib. Dr. Krupashankar, would you consider bevacizumab or niraparib?
If somebody's got even HRD negative and BRCA is also negative, I wouldn't give them a PARP inhibitor, because the magnitude of benefit is much lesser in those patients, even if you look at all these studies, and it just doesn't justify the cost. If you look at the cost effectiveness analysis or the MCBS,
somebody does not have any problems on cost.
That's fine. Yeah, but I would just give bevacizumab, because even by giving bevacizumab alone, you might probably get the same advantage of doing a PARP inhibitor in somebody who's BRCA negative and HRD negative as well.
So one thing is there, in a R0 resection, there is no advantage of adding bevacizumab. Unless there is R1 resection is there, or there is a situs, or it is stage 4 disease. So in R0 resection, I don't think we need to, just because today presentation is on we have to give bevacizumab. I don't think so. That is indicated in this.
So one thing is clear: if it is HRD negative or BRCA negative, the adding even PARP inhibitors does not have any great benefit. It might be little, because the trials which have been done are all skewed, because they did not selectively see that patient which were HRD negative, BRCA negative. Only a few trials have seen, and the magnitude of benefit is very small, and it is so small that it is equivalent to that of bevacizumab. So probably bevacizumab or niraparib are good options. We don't know. And moving to the next question. So the patient is recurrence free for 3 years. So that is very good. She is also happy. And now she got a blood test outside and found that the CA125 is rising. You called her after 6 months, but the CA125 is rising, and she is performance status 0. and scan showed that there is minimal ascites and new onset peritoneal deposits in the pelvis. So, Dr. Bhavesh, what will be your preferred line of management now? So she is a platinum sensitive tumor, and we'll take it for that she received PARP inhibitor, and now she has progressed. So what do you want to do?
So here again, I would like to take my surgical colleague's opinion because second surgery would be a good option for her if she can again undergo an R0 resection,
And
followed by obviously chemotherapy.
So Dr. Tupa, do you agree with Dr. Bhavesh that you would still go ahead with surgery? Or you want to give, because she's had a good time with post chemotherapy and PARP inhibitors, she's had a good time, or you just want to give chemotherapy and see what happens? Then later consider.
I would definitely have secondary cytoreduction as an option, but I would definitely give systemic therapy before that and then try and take her up for secondary cytoreductive surgery.
With the surgeon in the panel, would you consider this patient? We don't have the images, but patient is performance status 0. She has minimal ascites and she has few peritoneal deposits in the pelvis. Would you consider cytoreduction in this patient?
Absolutely, yes, because I personally believe that ovary is one disease where the extent of cytoreduction actually directly correlates to the survival, as shown by multiple, papers by Bristow et al. And other people as well. And currently adding to that is the OV HIPEC trial. I know that came for, interval cytoreduction where you add on HIPEC, but, in this kind of a scenario where initially HIPEC was approved for a patient with peritoneal disease in the recurrent setting, I would also consider HIPEC. And this patient has got a good chance. She had upfront lot of peritoneal disease. She was taken up for surgery, achieved an R0 resection. Then she responded well to chemotherapy, has a good 3-year DFS. And likely she has failed only in the pelvis and again few peritoneal nodules from, whatever you have told me.
Sure.
So based on that, I will plan for a pelvic peritonectomy with HIPEC, and then definitely, second line chemotherapy. I mean, not second line. In this case, it will be a re-challenge cisplatin because
I think all of our panelists are the same. So we have a recent data presented in ASCO, AGO Desktop 3, and there is a significant, we have to probably, what we understood from this is patients who underwent complete resection when they had recurrence, they had the significant improvement in PFS, but those just for the sake of operating, if the patient could not undergo complete resection, probably they had the similar benefit as only taking chemotherapy. That is what I inferred. Is this the same with all the panelists?
Ram, if I could just quickly point out something. See, we had 3 similar trials as well. See, the Desktop 3 was one. Then you have the Shanghai Gynec-Oncology Group study as well. And then you had the GOG 213 study as well. So GOG 213 study was actually negative because they gave bevacizumab as well, in addition to Taxol and Carbo. They did not show a statistically significant PFS or recurrence-free survival benefit. Whereas the other 2 studies, the Desktop and the Shanghai studies, were actually positive. So, I mean, like for me, it's a mixed bag, but definitely there is a definite role of secondary cytoreductive surgery in optimally selected patients. But whether should it be offered to everybody is still a big question mark. Because I would go with the Desktop criteria, the AGO criteria, and offer secondary cytoreduction only for a select few patients. And again, the data for HIPEC, I mean, like we're only extrapolating it from the first line. I don't think there's any strong data to suggest that in the secondary cytoreduction you add HIPEC actually improves survival.
So surgeon in the panel. So which is the surgeon in the panel? Which is the patient criteria which you would select for secondary cytoreduction? 3-4 criteria, and beyond that, everybody goes for chemotherapy.
See, I would, the first point that we have to take into consideration is, the PFI, the platinum-free interval, and of course, the extent of initial disease which she had. Now, this is a patient who had an obvious stage 3 disease, and she was completely cytoreduced, and after that, she has had a good response to chemotherapy with a PFI of more than 3 years. So that all those criteria go in for a good thing. The same patient, if she had recurred within, let's say, a year or so, then that points to a bad disease, because in spite of good surgery and good chemotherapy,
so
the
higher
PFI is
platinum
going to
interval
be
we
one.
would consider. And
Next is going to be the extent of recurrence, the PCI score, if I may. I mean, it's not really a PCI score, but the CT guided PCI score, whatever you're going to get, if it is going to be an extensive recurrence, then you'll be more inclined
so probably
to put the
patients
patient
with
on.
upper abdominal disease, you wouldn't consider doing secondary cytoreduction. Yeah. Any other
And
indication?
of course, the performance status of the patient and ascites. If there is large volume ascites, then that again points to the indication that the patient may not have a good response. So that again will be one indication for chemo, and then assessing for surgery. And then again, the performance status. If the performance status is good, obviously the patient
Dr.
is not going
Bhavesh,
to
you
be
want to
for
make a point?
surgery.
So he says that even at significant ascites, he wants to do cytoreduction after chemotherapy. Would you agree with that?
Also, Dr. Paulomi is there. You can take her opinion. She's also a surgeon.
Actually, Ram, I would just like to add to your question that following strictly AGO criteria, this is for the surgeons, do you still expect that post-surgery there will be any residual tumor? Because there are very strict guidelines and it's a very favorable group. I think if surgeon goes in with the proper AGO criteria, there should be hardly any residual disease. Do you agree, Dr. Balaji, Dr. Paulomi?
No, I didn't get your question, Bhavesh. Sorry, would you mind repeating it again?
In this case, when we are strictly following AGO criteria, especially for this AGO desktop study, when you see this column, there is a surgery but with residual tumor. So in practice, if you actually follow a strict AGO criteria, do you think that still you will come out with a residual tumor?
I agree with you in the sense that, if you follow the AGO guidelines, then this is a patient who is better benefited by chemotherapy. But in practice, what we see is it's the resectability of the tumor and the extent of disease. So if you have a limited disease, generally speaking, cytoreducibility is going to be, it's going to be a complete cytoreduction. And that helps in the chemotherapy as well in the post, operative setting.
Sure.
So
Point
that
taken.
way, I
So
would
we'll move
point say as a modified criteria rather than following the strict guidelines here.
Sure. We'll move on. So this patient underwent secondary cytoreduction and it was a complete R0 resection. So the surgeon did a very good job as usual. And now, do you want to give maintenance therapy for this patient? Dr. Bhavesh?
I would treat it just like a primary tumor type, and again after a cytoreductive surgery, I would still give adjuvant, or maybe you can say a pseudo-adjuvant chemotherapy.
Sure. You give chemotherapy, and do you want to give maintenance therapy for this patient?
In this case, maybe I'll add bevacizumab. So bevacizumab maintenance would be a good option. I don't know whether I can repeat PARP inhibitors again as a maintenance because it has already been given in the post-first line. Post-first line.
Dr. Krupashankar, do you also agree that you will give bevacizumab for this patient?
Yeah, Ram, I would agree with Bhavesh. I think I would also give Bev maintenance here. Yeah.
Okay, so we cannot have it very simple, isn't it? So the patient took PARP inhibitors for 6 months after the initial surgery, and as usual, as any rich patients, they stopped PARP inhibitors after 6 months because she was completely all right and she had so many visits to hospital. So now she underwent secondary IDS. Now, do you want to give PARP inhibitor for this patient because he is germline positive, or do you want to give bevacizumab for this patient?
So probably I'll take that, Ram. So the thing is, if the patient has stopped it at 6 months for whatever reasons, then probably there might be a benefit. I'm talking about it not based out of guidelines or recommendations. I'm just saying in practice, definitely if somebody's not had the entire 2 years duration of olaparib and has stopped at 6 months for whatever reasons, then I believe there's a fair enough chance for us to actually put her back on olaparib, PARP inhibitors.
Dr. Bhavesh, you would also give PARP inhibitors for this patient who has stopped at 6 months?
Yes, I would like to try it because even with just use of 6 months and without bevacizumab, if she has maintained for 3 years, that shows that probably she is in that favorable group. And maybe here I would just go one step ahead and maybe chemo bevacizumab followed by beva plus PARP inhibitor as a mix.
Okay. So that is...
No, I will not agree because in a relapse setting, in a sensitive relapse, both bevacizumab and PARP inhibitors are not, none of the trials are worked. And only the one in the primary setting is given both the combination. In this setting, combination is not there because we don't have any data for that.
Yes.
One
so,
of the
I agree. I think
Dr. Bhavesh said out of extrapolation rather than extrapolation of the first line. So
you see, this is a practical thing. I want to just tell you that
it's not at all practical, sir.
No, I'll come on that. In this setting, there is always a problem which drug to give in maintenance. For example, you are given carboplatin or paclitaxel with bevacizumab. She has shown complete response. Now she's BRCA positive. What maintenance will you give? will you give bevacizumab maintenance or you will give PARP inhibitors? Now the thing is the disease-free survival with PARP after solo 2 is about almost 2.5 to 3 years you get. Whereas with bevacizumab you get about 15, 16, 14, 16 months. So if that is a choice, I would like to go to the PARP inhibitors rather than.
I think most would prefer PARP inhibitors because it's more of tailored therapy to her, and bevacizumab is kind of a general flat therapy for any patient. And so, Dr. Bhavesh, what would be your PARP inhibitor of choice in this patient?
I think I will go with the
olaparib, rucaparib, niraparib, veliparib.
Go with the same PARP inhibitor, whatever she has used before, because I clinically now trust that PARP inhibitor has worked for her. And just to add, Dr. Rajeshwar Singh's comment, that since if you take any trial as a solo to what you have quoted, they would have not considered any patient who have already received olaparib. So we cannot actually put that into this setting. So this is strictly a practical call rather than a guideline call.
Yeah. So one thing is we cannot have this so simple. So she took olaparib and she stopped it. So she is not at all happy taking olaparib again. Would you still give her olaparib, or you want to change PARP inhibitor? She is not at all happy with olaparib. That's why she stopped.
So yeah,
Krupa can tell this.
But why do you want to give anything to her now? After 6 months, she's all right. She's completed and she's left after 6 months.
No, that is out of the. This is only for the discussion.
I agree with Ram, because these are practical things that many a times patient will not follow the book or the guidelines, and they will do what they like.
So you want to do olaparib,
this is what happens in practice.
veliparib, talazoparib. Which parib do you want to give her now?
No, so Ram, I think we've had the ASCO 2020 update on the Solo 2 study as well. So that's the first trial which has actually shown an overall survival improvement as well in the second line for platinum-sensitive relapsed ovarian cancer. But I agreed, we are only extrapolating here because this patient has already had 6 months of olaparib. But I would still be tempted to use olaparib in this patient, because it's been long and time and trusted. It's the first PARP inhibitor that we've had for quite some time, and we have the long-term data as well. So that would push my decision towards olaparib.
Okay.
Yeah, but Krupa, Ram is saying that she doesn't want to take olaparib. What's your
No, he would. Krupa, he is going to give her olaparib based on Solo 2.
He will convince her.
Okay, Ram.
Okay, I think that is it. We are running short of time.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Dr. Anita, can I just have a question on this? I just had a doubt on this case.
Yeah, you can.
Yeah,
Yes, please.
I just wanted to ask, with a patient who has backup in the US and a BRCA positive, has she not asked about her increased chances of breast cancer, just to divert? I mean, when you are dealing with a BRCA positive patient, wouldn't you give her a genetic counseling and also tell her about the risk for breast cancer? And I believe this is a case that you have actually had an experience with. So didn't she talk to you about a mastectomy or a prophylaxis for the breast? I mean, I'm just very curious.
In a clinical setting, we would definitely consider discussing that, madam, because her mother also had breast cancer, and she is proven.
I mean, because it's I guess it's a real life question. So with patients who are aware to this extent, do they actually talk about this, is what I'm asking.
We can discuss,
the concern would
potential
also
benefits, because who all are going to get mastectomy done, her relatives, etc., herself, her mother, opposite breast. So there are a lot of issues. Who all will undergo oophorectomy? So there are a lot of issues. I think that is beyond the scope of the present discussion, and we'll stop there because of the lack of shortage of time.
Yes, genetic counseling is needed. Thank you.
Definitely.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ram, and all the panelists. I request the organizers to share the screen of the, okay, I shared the, Arkesh Rao. I don't know how this screen has come. Okay, I am Kashish. If you can share the sponsor screen, that will be good. And I think we have huge number of questions in the chat box. I don't know how to go about all these things. Okay, just a quick question. Okay, that we had a thanks to Abbott for sponsoring our last session. Thank you very much for the anti-VEGF anti-VEGF use. Now, quick question. There's some question. The problem of toxicity. Dr. Bharat Rangarajan has asked. Mortality outside of the trial was not acceptable. So, how do you go about this? For in a case of pazopanib, anybody can take the question. Few questions I will just call out before we finalize.
I think Dr. Bharat wanted to ask regarding probably the IP therapy. That's what I thought, because it was comment. The comment came at the same time. So if an IP chemotherapy is contemplated, obviously at the beginning itself we are counseling patient regarding the toxicity. So if patient is willing for those toxicity only, then IP chemotherapy should be given. So that is what we follow at our center also. We give them an option, and if patient is ready for everything, whatever we have suggested and whatever the trial has shown, then definitely yes, we should go ahead, because we should offer the best therapy to the patient.
Yeah, there is also a question from Dr. Rifat saying PARP plus bevacizumab, what would be the toxicity?
They don't have overlapping toxicity. The toxicity is quite different in both the individual toxicities are there. For bevacizumab, you know that toxicity of the vascular thrombosis, which can be the arterial or the venous thrombosis, proteinuria, hypertension, and the fistula formation. These are the main toxicity. Whereas with PARP inhibitor, olaparib, basically anemia, nausea are the two main thing, and a little bit of neutropenia. Nausea is very, very severe, very difficult to control, and anemia and fatigue are these are the two main things for olaparib. So they are not overlapping, but different toxicities. The numbers increase, the number of toxicities increase. And they are both difficult drugs to give. It is not easy for some patients. Bevacizumab is relatively less toxic.
Yes, there was a lot of question regarding the testing for the BRCA testing. How do you do, what is the authenticity? Do you run the NGS? So a quick question from any of the molecular pathologists around, how do you do the BRCA testing here? They're consisting of 100 genes to test. How authentic is our BRCA report? Anybody can take the question? Anybody is there online now?
Dr. Anita, this is Ganesh here. So,
Dr. Ganesh, yes,
yeah.
Please.
So the thing is, it is not actually 100 genes. It is actually BRCA1 is one gene, but then it's a huge gene spread across with different introns and exons. So what is important for us to understand is where are these mutations located and in which part of the gene is what is very important. So probably the person who asked this question probably was meaning to say that if there are more than 100 mutations, I guess. So it's very true that there are more than one mutation which is significant for the causation of the disease. So where these mutations occur and how do we determine, are we going to do an entire BRCA1 gene sequencing to identify all the mutations, or are we going to look at specific locus, which probably is kind of, something which is seen more commonly in Indian as compared to the Western is always a big question. So the entire gene sequencing is very important. That's how we will go about to see where are the mutations and how is it significantly correlated with the published data. So a gene sequencing, complete BRCA1 gene sequencing will be the best way to identify. Yes.
Okay. I think that's all about the questions. Some more questions are there. I don't think so we'll be able to complete. I thank you, everybody. Thank the sponsors. Thank Kavina Creation. Thanks for all the presenters, moderators, panelists, chairperson, and more than 100 delegates joined us today evening for this session. Thanks, everybody. I think we got a good take-home message because many of the topics are not usually discussed. And thanks to everybody. We'll soon meet. Stay safe. Stay connected. I also thank my secretary, Mrs. Vijay Bharati, and her team for her work, and Kavina Creations for getting all of us together. Thank you very much. Stay safe.
Thank you, madam. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.